Okay.
And yeah, let me quickly introduce you before. Thank you so much, Lori, for joining us. For everyone today, I would like to introduce Lori Friend. We've known each other for years. I was a student of Lori first when like in a group a long time ago. I think it was 2020, 21. And then I worked with Lori 101 last year. We worked 3 months and I learned a lot. Thank you so much, Lori, for accepting my invitation to come to our community. Our community is really excited to have you and learn from you and see how we can improve our pronunciation. Because as a immigrant, and especially as a professional immigrant, we have a lot of challenges to be presented as a professional because the language is the key to sound professional. So we would love to have you today and learn from you. We have 1 hour, so till 5 p.m. Mountain time. So hopefully have enough time. And if anyone has any question, please feel free to raise your hand or send a message on the group chat. I will be monitoring that. Thank you.
Okay. Well, so this is a difference for me. Um, so I'll just tell you a little bit about myself first before I get started. As her said, I did graduate back in 2003, so I've been in the field for quite some time. I started out in the medical profession, and I was working in neurological rehab. So working with patients with strokes, brain injuries, Parkinson's, things like that. Loved it. It was so rewarding to work with the patients. But there came a point when I was kind of done working in the medical profession. There are a lot of things in the medical profession that aren't so fun, like dealing with insurance companies and documentation and bureaucracy within the organization, all of that. So I was really looking for something different. And I remembered how fun it was to work on accent modification when I was a student in school. So I thought, I'm going to try a pivot here. And so I did. I switched to accent modification. And I have to tell you, I have never regretted that decision. That was in 2017. And I've just loved every minute of it. It's kind of like that old adage that when you find a job that you love, you're not actually working anymore because you're having fun while you're doing it. So, that's how it's been for me ever since 2017. I've never looked back. All right, so, um, as I mentioned, I have worked with quite a few Russian native speakers. That's not the majority of my students for sure, but I have worked with quite a few over the years. And so there are some things that are specific for the Russian speaking audience, and that's kind of what I want to address today. So these, as the title suggests, are small changes, but they can have a really big impact on how you're perceived in the business world. Okay, so today I'm just going to give you a brief introduction to communication in the American workforce and why it's so important. Then we're going to talk about specific pronunciation patterns that might be different between Russian and English. Then we're going to go over the rhythm and intonation differences between the two languages. And then we're going to cover something that's a little different, which is communication style. And that can be different across cultures. So that's also kind of an added thing that isn't part of pronunciation and intonation and rhythm, but it's still really important in the American workplace. I'm going to cover some practical ways that you can address each of these things. And then at the very end, of course, we'll have time for questions and discussion and maybe even some practice if you want to. Okay. So in American communication, we're not trying to correct errors, so to speak, because Russian speakers tend to be pretty accurate in most of their pronunciation. So what we're addressing is more sound and style. It's how you are perceived. And the thing is that people often form impressions about your confidence level, about your comfort with the language within seconds of meeting you. It's not fair, but that's what happens. And your pronunciation, your rhythm, the intonation that you use, and just your overall communication style can really shape that perception. And like I said, it happens quickly. So little adjustments can really improve the sound and how your conversation flows. And what that does, it leads to better connection. That's really what we're all after in the business world is good connection, whether it's with uh, the people that you supervise or with your colleagues or even with supervisors, um, or people who are just higher up than you in the company. You still want to have this connection with them. You want to be able to effectively communicate. So that's the goal. So we're going to start. Hang on one second. I need a sip of water. We're going to start with the pronunciation differences. And like I said, we're not talking necessarily about errors, but we're talking about patterns of speech that tend to be different just because Russian language patterns are different than American English language patterns. And one thing I want to really clarify at the beginning is that not all of you are going to be using these patterns that don't match with American English. Some of them might be pertinent to you, some of them might not. And that's the same across all languages. Not everybody has the same issues going on. I'll give you an example. When I was a kid, I had a good friend, and we both grew up in Washington State. And she would call it Washington. She said she lived in Washington. And I always thought that was so strange. Like, where is this R coming from? There's no R in that word, but that's how she pronounced it. And I realized that somewhere along the way, she picked up this pattern. And it might have been from her mom, from her dad, from a grandma or grandpa, who knows? But somebody uh, inserted this word into her vocabulary, and so she said it that way. And it had nothing to do with where she lived. It was just something she had picked up. So even among native speakers, there are different patterns going on. But the ultimate goal is to sound natural and confident and engaging. You want communication with you to be an inviting prospect. All right, so the first pronunciation pattern that I'd like to address is the tapped T. You might have noticed that American speakers don't say notice, city, meeting, or what is. That's exactly how the British would say it, by the way. Americans would say notice, city, meeting, and what is. What we're doing here is a quick little flick of the tongue tip. It's not a true T in the sense that a true T has this little bit of air after it. We call it aspiration. And a true T sounds like true T. That's the T that the British would use. Americans would call them British. So the tapped T occurs when the T is falling in between vowel sounds. And by the way, you might have learned this sound as the flap T. It's the same thing. So when that T has vowels around it, it's typically pronounced with the tongue just flicking up momentarily, and it sounds like a very light D. So, what it does for your speech is it makes it sound smoother, more relaxed, and more natural sounding. Not using a tapped T is going to result in a much more formal sound, which is exactly why British English sounds so much more formal than American English. This is one of the main reasons. because of that T sound. But like I said, it only happens between vowel sounds. And for most people, they can get to the point where they recognize where a tapped T should be within words. So I'm talking about this T that's occurring in the middle of a word between vowels, as in notice, city, meeting, and so forth. But where it gets a little more difficult is when you're linking two words together, as in what is. And it's hard to recognize that that should also be a tapped T. Or, for example, if I'm saying, I love chocolate ice cream, but I really love strawberry. So when I said, I was tapping that T. The British would say, but I really love strawberry. Americans would say, but I really love strawberry. So that's the tapped T. And it's a very small change, but because it occurs so frequently, it can make a huge difference in how relaxed and natural you sound. So the next thing I wanted to talk about is linking ing word endings to other words. So, this is something that I very frequently hear from my Russian students or anybody who speaks a Russian language. A phrase like going over might sound like going over. Cleaning up might sound like cleaning up. Being present might sound like being present. The reason for this is that in the Russian language, you're trying to preserve those word endings and say them very clearly and precisely. The problem is that that ending is not a very precise sound. It's ending in the nose, very nasal. And so there's no sharp ending to a word like going, cleaning, or being. They end here. So the goal is that you want to be able to link these words with other words without using a g or a k sound. What that does is it changes the placement. This is really just a placement issue. It's not a pronunciation issue, it's a placement issue. I guess that could be considered a pronunciation issue. But if you think about where the sound is placed, your tongue is touching in the back of your throat. That's correct. Or on your soft palate is more exact. But where is the sound coming from? It's coming from here. And when you change that to ng or now you've changed it into a mouth sound. It started nasal, but then it went into the mouth. So when you're linking these words with ing to other words, you want to keep that connection between the two words nasal. What that might sound like, if I was to do it really, really slowly, would be something like this: going over. So that is becoming the beginning of over. Going over. Hear the difference between that and going over? I'll give you the second example. Cleaning up versus cleaning up. Now I'm turning that into a mouth sound. Or being present versus being present. So it's a matter of keeping that linking of the words nasal because you've got a nasal sound there. All right, that one takes a little bit of practice because it's uncomfortable for most of my students, but it definitely can be learned. And then the last pronunciation issue I want to talk about is the voicing component of linking. So when we have a voiceless word ending, like or s, those can sound voiced for a Russian speaker when you're linking to an initial voiced sound in a word. So to give you some examples, make them might sound like make them, or take this might sound like "take this," or "stop by" might sound like "stop by." So, what's happening there is the voicing component of this second word, them, this, and by, those all start with voiced sounds. That is taking over that ending sound. It's the assimilation process. So that voiced sound is taking over from the voiceless ending on that first word. And that's something that you don't want to let happen in your speech. You want to keep voiceless word endings voiceless, even when you're linking. I think most people from most languages understand how important linking is in English because it's often important in their native language as well. It's just done differently. So in English, if you have a word that ends with a voiceless sound, it needs to stay voiceless even as you're heading into a voiced sound right after that. Okay. And if any of you have any questions about that, be sure to let me know. All right. So we've just talked about the pronunciation aspect of the language, and that would be the technical side of the language. That's like the technical manual for the language is the pronunciation. But the rhythm and the intonation are the music of the language. And English really relies heavily on stress. So, which syllable we are emphasizing within each word. Pitch variation, so the ups and downs in our pitch, and timing. So some words are emphasized and stretched out, while other words are kept very, very short and almost hard to hear in our sentences. All three of these things are part of the music of the language. And what's really interesting is that native speakers are going to notice those aspects way before they notice your pronunciation. You can get away with so many pronunciation errors as long as you have native sounding stress, intonation, which is the pitch variation, and timing. I'm going to give you an example of that. So, I have a grandson. I have several, but one of my grandsons might say to me, well, let's say I ask him, "What would you like to eat for lunch today?" And he says, Okay, so I know exactly what he just said, even though he did not articulate that phrase clearly at all. He basically said, but because I know the intonation of our language, I know that what he said was, "I don't know. I don't know." It always has that same intonation when someone is answering a question. So, even though he didn't clearly articulate his words at all, I knew exactly what he was saying to me. So, that's a great example of how you can get away with a lot of pronunciation errors and still be perceived quite clearly when you have the music of the language intact. So, the first aspect I want to talk about is that syllable stress. What syllable we're emphasizing within each word. And I want to really drive the point home that this involves training your ears to hear the stressed syllable when native speakers are talking. It's one of the most important skills you can learn in English. And it's really hard to learn through book learning. So, what I find is that most of my students, of course, I work with adults, I don't work with children. And adults like to learn things through books and instructional videos, things like that. They want rules that they can follow. Kids don't learn that way. Kids learn by listening and imitation. Who do you think is better at learning languages? Of course, we all know it's kids. Kids are fantastic at learning languages because they're not relying on rules. They're relying on their ears. And this is a skill that cannot be discounted. It is so important. So I just want to give you some examples of some words that I really commonly hear misstressed. And this goes for all languages. Some of these words are just words that most people learn to say incorrectly. So, for example, interesting might sound like interesting. Now, that's the British way of saying it, and that's why it doesn't sound right to an American. Americans say interesting. Coworker or colleague might sound like coworker, colleague. Again, that's the British way to say those words, but Americans put the stress at the beginning. Coworker, colleague. Sometimes might sound like sometimes. Organize might sound like organize. And along with that one word that I didn't put up here, but realize might sound like realize. Same pattern there. Comfortable might sound like comfortable. Develop might sound like develop. Idea could sound like idea. Necessary might sound like necessary. Communicate can sound like communicate or communicate, which is the British way. But Americans put the stress right there on that second syllable, communicate. Industry might sound like industry. Engineer might sound like engineer. Represent can sound like represent. Specific might sound like specific. Document can sound like document. Supervisor can sound like supervisor. And particular can sound like particular. Now, you might say some of those words correctly, you might say some of them with incorrect word stress, but these are some of the really, really common words that I hear misstressed. The next aspect of rhythm and intonation is pitch variation. So, in general, and of course, this does not apply across all speakers, but in general, Russian intonation as compared to American English intonation tends to be flatter. It tends to drop very reliably at the end of statements, and it sounds firm and decisive. Those can all be really good things, but not in certain contexts. So, in American English, especially in situations of business where persuasion is important, American English uses more pitch variation, and it will often add an upward inflection to statements in collaborative settings. What do I mean by that? So normally, English does fall at the end of statements, but when we're trying to indicate that I am open to other people's ideas, or I'm indicating that I'm open to feedback, I might say, instead of saying, I think we could try using a different approach, I might say, I think we could try using a different approach. Instead of saying, it might help if we adjust the timeline. I might say, it might help if we adjust the timeline. So I'm headed upward there to indicate, what do you think? I'm inviting your opinion with that statement. Now, be careful with this one, because if you head upward at the end of every statement, it's going to make you sound unsure. That's something you definitely don't want in the world of business. But when you're specifically trying to indicate, I am open to feedback here, it's kind of a nice strategy to have in your toolbox. Another thing about American English is that there's often a smile in the voice. So, what do I mean by a smile in the voice? Um, so I could say, good morning, how are you? When I greet a colleague. I've said the right words. Good morning, how are you? But if I say it with a smile in my voice, it sounds like this. Good morning, how are you? Quite a bit of difference there in the tone. I'll give you another example. I might say, thanks for joining the meeting today. But if I say that with a smile in my voice, I'm saying, "Thanks for joining the meeting today." You can hear the difference in tone, and it indicates to your listener that you're wanting that connection with them. I'm sure everyone has had the experience of talking on the phone to someone and you can't see their face. You can't see whether they're smiling or not, but you can tell their mood and their tone just by listening to their voice. You know whether they're in a good mood or a bad mood just by the tone of their voice. So that's kind of what I'm talking about when I'm talking about a smile in the voice. All right, the last aspect of rhythm and intonation is the timing. And what I mean by timing is that in American English, especially, but I would say this happens in British English as well, unstressed words, which are often those small words like to, of, for, and, those are often shorter and lighter, and that helps the speech flow more naturally. So, for example, to the office becomes to the office. Of course becomes of course. And I think becomes and I think. So the goal is that we're keeping the vowels. You notice it's the vowels that I'm cutting short here. We're keeping the vowels in the unstressed function words very short in duration. And what this does for us is it highlights the content words. So the content words here are office, course, and think. And the other words are just there to make it grammatically correct, but they're not carrying the weight of the meaning. I think all of you have probably had the experience of watching a TV show or a movie, and the people are talking really fast. And you're not catching every word they're saying. Your brain is not able to do that because the speech is going too fast. So, what are the words that are dropping out for you? It's often these little function words. And what your brain is focusing on is the content words. So, this is a way that we just naturally bring attention to the content words in our speech, which are carrying the meaning. The other words are not so important for the meaning, so we're going to shorten them down. All right. So, we've talked about pronunciation, we've talked about rhythm and intonation, and now we're going to address communication style. So, differences across cultures in how people communicate can really impact how people perceive you in a professional setting. I'm sure you all already know this, but I have a question for you. Have you ever felt like the intent of your message was misunderstood when you were giving a meeting or when you had a personal interaction with another person? I'm sure everyone has experienced that before, even as a native speaker. I've experienced it for sure. You intend to say one thing and you're using the right words, but it maybe could have been worded differently so that it would land differently with your listener. So there are unconscious biases for all accents. Nobody is immune to this. It's not about changing who you are. You should be able to be who you are in any context. But it's about understanding and shaping how people perceive you in certain settings, and that you can change. Um, Russian communication style in general, and again, this is a big generality, can be somewhat direct. It's very efficient, meaning that not a lot of words are wasted, and it's honest. Very honest. Whereas American communication style often prefers things like cushioning language and indirect phrasing and positive framing. And I'm going to go over each of those and just kind of give you examples of what I'm talking about. So, cushioning language, what is that? It's adding words that make the tone of what you're saying more collaborative. So instead of saying something like, we need to change this. You might say, we might want to consider adjusting this. And what this cushioning language does is it softens the message. Instead of being so direct, it's giving it a little bit of a pillow there. Some common phrases would be, I think, it seems like, we might want to, um, I wonder if, one option might be. Those are all very common cushioning phrases. And you might be thinking to yourself, sounds wishy washy to me. I don't want to sound wishy washy in business. I want to sound like I know what I'm talking about. But this can be done even at very high levels. You will hear presidents and CEOs use this kind of language when they're trying to create a collaborative atmosphere. So, indirect phrasing is kind of similar to cushioning language, but a little bit different. So, it's expressing your thought as a question or a suggestion or an observation instead of as a direct statement. So, for example, instead of saying, this doesn't work, you might say, I'm not sure this will get us where we need to go. So again, you might think that sounds not very confident, but it's simply softening your language so that it lands better with your listener and you get the desired effect that you're after. Next, we have positive framing, which is simply emphasizing the possibilities, the solutions, or the improvements instead of emphasizing the problem at hand. So instead of saying something like, this presentation is confusing, you might say something like, adding a few more examples could make this presentation even stronger. There's no mention of the problem, but the listener kind of understands from that there is a problem. I don't have enough examples in my presentation. And she's letting me know this in a very nice way. So we're addressing the problem by giving solutions to the problem, not by just pointing out the problem. All right. So the good news is that all of these are skills that can be built. And you'll notice that unlike with many other languages, for example, maybe Spanish or Chinese or some of these other languages that have much bigger differences in pronunciation, the pronunciation differences are really just patterns that once you learn the pattern, you can change it pretty easily. You just have to have enough repetition of doing it a different way. So, pronunciation patterns can definitely be changed. And the nice thing is that we live in the era of ChatGPT, and ChatGPT can create endless practice materials for you. Let's say you want to work on that skill of linking ing word endings to other words. You simply go to ChatGPT and you ask it to create you sentences where ing word endings are linked to other words. And it will create sentences for you all day if you want that. It can put them into paragraphs. Um, Now, what you're missing in that is feedback. So that's where sometimes actually going to the step of buying a pronunciation app, for example, that will give you some feedback might be useful. I will tell you that I haven't been super impressed with most of the pronunciation apps that I have explored so far. I feel like AI is not quite there yet when it comes to giving you feedback. It's definitely going to learn it. Eventually, I'm going to be out of a job because AI is going to learn how to do what I do. But right now, it's not quite there yet. And so it doesn't always catch everything. It doesn't always give you accurate feedback, but having a coach is a very good way to get that feedback, or simply going to something like a study group type setting where you're listening to the feedback that's being given to other members of the group, and then sometimes you get some feedback. That kind of thing really goes a long way. Um, Matching American intonation and rhythm. So, as I mentioned, the best way to learn this is to do it like kids do it. listen, repeat, listen, repeat, and try to get as exact as you can with your repetition. The reason it doesn't work to learn intonation and rhythm by learning rules is that when you're in the midst of a conversation, your brain cannot access those rules. Conversation moves fast. And in order for your brain to pull up, okay, what's the operative rule here in this circumstance? The moment has already gone by the time that happens. You can't do that with every word that you're saying. So, learning it like children do, the listening and imitating is the very best way to learn American intonation and rhythm. And the way I like to encourage my students to do this is find somebody on YouTube that you really love how they sound. You would be very happy if you sounded just like them, and spend a little time every day, even if it's only 5 minutes. Spend a little bit of time each day listening to and imitating that person. Of course, it helps if the person is not a super fast talker, but we all have sounds and styles that we prefer. Some people like that more energetic, quick kind of speech. Other people like their ears like a more slower and deliberate sound. And so you have to pick what sounds nice to you and what you would like to sound like. Pick somebody who matches that and spend time listening to and imitating. So, what that looks like is the speaker says something, you hit the pause button and you try to match them exactly. The reason I like things like YouTube is because you're not only copying the sound of what they're saying and the pronunciation of how they're saying it, you're copying everything about it. So if they raise their eyebrows, you raise your eyebrows. If they get louder, you get louder. If they use a gesture, you use a gesture. Copy everything about that person. You're not trying to become that person. What you're trying to do is learn the music of the language. And you like how this person sings. I'm using the word sing in quotes here. You like how they sound. So you want your sound to be similar to this person's. And this is the best way to learn it. All right. Softening your communication style. So those things that I just mentioned about cushioning phrases uh, and using the smile in the voice and using the indirect phrasing and the positive framing, things like that. Chat GPT can help you with that as well. Ask it to give you examples of direct versus cushioning language. Um, Maybe examples of direct versus indirect, examples of um, focusing on the problem versus focusing on the solution. So, positive framing, all of these things, it can give you examples in just sentences next to each other, kind of like I did earlier. But it could also give you, for example, an entire dialogue between two speakers. And you can ask it to bold those kinds of statements so you can become familiar with what they look like and sound like within the context of an actual conversation. We are so fortunate to live in an age where we've got a tool like AI to help us with learning some of these things. So again, you're not changing who you are. Rather, you're expanding your influence and you're learning to be adaptable across different cultural contexts. If you traveled to Japan and you had to speak English with Japanese people, there would be different considerations there. But today we're talking about the American workplace. And so that's what I focused on today. But really, you're just learning to be adaptable and to be as effective as you can possibly be within the context that you are in. So, this is my contact information. I just want to thank you so much for having me come and speak to you. I want to open it up now for questions or comments. And so I'm going to stop talking here and let you ask your questions.
Thank you so much, Lori. This is wonderful. I think in such a short time, we received a lot of wonderful information that can help us immediately improve our pronunciation. And we will share this presentation with everyone also. If right, Lori, you can share it with me.
Yes,
I will share it
absolutely.
with the team. Hmm.
Mhm.
Awesome. If anyone has any question, please. Yes, Anastasia.
Okay. Hi, Lori. Thank
Hi.
you so much for the presentation. I just wanted to ask you, like, what is your stance on shadowing techniques? Because a lot of people, they offer this technique as a solution, but like in my opinion, it's a little bit like overrated. So it's better to just to listen to something and then try to repeat it rather than just speaking at the same time with the person. What is your opinion on that?
Yeah, I agree with you on that. Speaking at the same time impacts how well you listen, in my opinion, because you can't focus on how you're saying something and also take in how they're saying it at the same time. So I agree with you. I like the technique of letting the person say their sentence or their phrase and then hitting the pause button so that you can practice saying it that same way.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was a good question.
Thank you.
And I'll also just let you know that if you have a desire to just kind of get a little bit of feedback from me on how you sound, if there's anything that I could recommend that you practice on, I'm fine with just having a short little conversation with anybody too.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for offering that. We already have a couple of participants that asking how they can continue working with you. So maybe we can work on getting this smaller group, and then we can work together.
I would love
Anyone
that.
wants?
Yeah, that would be really fun. It's kind of hard. This is a big topic to address in 1 hour. And so
Mhm.
having more time to really get into the specifics is nice, I think.
Yes, yes, we will work on that. Alina says, Lori's such a wonderful presentation. I enjoyed it so much. Thank you,
No,
Alina.
thanks. I really appreciate that.
Yes, and we have a couple of comments about smiling during the conversation. Dina says Russian speakers don't smile even when they want to.
Yes, and that's a skill you can learn.
Yes, let me comment on that too a little. It's funny because I work with a lot of Russian-speaking clients. If they're telling you a joke, sometimes they're not smiling, and they do use those phrases as you said. This doesn't work, or I don't like it, and there's no softening.
Yes. And sometimes, with jokes, it's actually a technique to kind of keep a deadpan expression when you're telling a joke. And sometimes that makes it land even funnier for your audience. So it kind of depends. But yeah, that is a definite issue. I was working with someone once who was recommended to me to work with me by her boss. She was a Russian native speaker, and her boss wanted her to work with me because he thought there was something going on pronunciation-wise that was making, her communication with the people she worked with difficult, and it didn't take me very long to realize there was nothing wrong with her pronunciation at all. It was simply how she was saying things and the tone she was using that was it was ruffling people's feathers, and they were not taking things the way she intended them.
Yes, yeah. Sometimes little things that we don't know and it sounds different and it may sounds like rude, considered rude rather than like just a direct message that we're trying to do sometime. Hmm.
Yeah, yeah, and in her defense, she was trying to be efficient, she was trying to be very honest, and all of those are qualities that we appreciate, in business especially. So it's a fine line there to walk between, having that efficiency and that honesty, and yet softening it a little bit.
Right. Right. Just using right words. That's very
Mhm,
good. Hmm.
mhm.
Thank you. Thank you. Any questions? We have 3 minutes. If anyone wants to jump in and say thoughts, insights.
And there are no questions actually from my side, but just wanted to say thank you so much for such a wonderful presentation. And that was so helpful. And actually, I really was excited to learn about music as a language, which is something I feel I'm not using a lot. So, and just want to know more about your programs and like trainings, what they have. But probably I will be reaching out using that email.
Yeah.
So,
So I do offer one-on-one private lessons if that's something that anyone is interested in. My so you kind of got a little bit of a taste of my instructional style, but I'm pretty I tried to hone in on like the top 3 things that would make the biggest difference for someone right off the bat. And we work on those to begin with instead of just addressing everything at once. We try to take it down to the top 3. And so I offer those. I also have my YouTube channel for those of you who maybe one-on-one training is just not within the budget right now. I have like 99 videos on my YouTube channel right now. So there probably are things that would be pertinent for each of you on that channel. You could check it out, and that would be totally free. So yeah, those are some of the ways that you could work with me. And then, as I mentioned, we're going to be discussing ways to possibly have this be more of an ongoing thing. So that might be an option too.
Yeah, yeah. I'm thinking about like smaller group. Maybe we can get 5 to 7 dedicated people that they want to continue practicing and learning. Because working in a group is very efficient as well. Sometimes we know that we do understand, and then when you see someone understands better, you will be like, okay, catching up, or maybe you will be like helping others. So that's a wonderful way to learn together.
Yes. And sometimes when you hear someone else speaking, it makes you aware of, oh my gosh, I do that same thing.
Mm.
And so it's very helpful to hear feedback that's given to someone else as well.
Yeah, 100%. Awesome. Yeah. Then, if anyone has any other questions, we will continue this conversation. And Lori, I will reach out to you very soon, and we can talk about the next steps for those who has interest in learning more how to sound more confident and communicate efficiently. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you again for having me here. It was really fun.
Thank you so much for your time. It was very, very interesting, insightful, and helpful. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
I'll send you this presentation.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.